today's fastTrack Academy, the latest developments in cyber insurance. So, for those of you who don't recognise my name is Patrick, and I'm the principal of the Academy. And my job today is to facilitate your learning event. As many of you will be aware, and it supports your CPD, and today's session will entitle you to an hour. So if you need that credit, you can record it. Now today's session is brought to us by Dan from AXA XL, the insurer, and a close partner of Diamond. And frankly, what better time to be talking about cyber and cyber risk? As we can't really turn on the news without learning about the co-op Jaguar Land Rover and the airport check-in issue over the weekend that had my flight cancelled. Now this is designed to be an interactive session. It's really going to delve into the evolving cyber threat landscape, including the key regulatory developments, and really remembering that cyber isn't just about covering ransomware. Dan is an underwriting expert, so we'll understand how he and his market is adapting to offer tailored, comprehensive coverage that will deal with evolving and diverse customer needs. And hopefully, Dan, the session is going to jump into life as we look at real world claims and incidents to get your insights into effective risk management strategies. As usual, we'll have questions and I'll turn to that. But really, in summary, what we're aiming to do here is to empower the risk management community by enhancing our knowledge and the tools needed to make really great informed decisions in the ever-changing and fast-moving world of cyber risk and cyber insurance. Now, by the end of today's session, so 11 o'clock, where we'll hard stop, you should be able to describe the cyber threat landscape, to explain the impact of the regulatory framework, identify key coverages required in a comprehensive cyber insurance policy, and to be able to readily discuss high-profile cyber claims and incidents. Now, turning to today's logistics, as I mentioned, we'll hard stop at 11. You'll see that on your control panel, there's a questions tab. If any question arises to Dan's presentation, park them there. We'll be turning over to questions at around about 11:15, and my job will be just to collate your questions and inquiries into a discussion with Dan, who will do his best to address all of those for us. Now, just to make you aware for your note taking, the slides will not be distributed on this occasion. However, the session will be recorded and should be available within 24 hours on the emic.com website behind the members login. So that's logistics. Let's turn to Dan Barrett. Now he's the underwriting manager, as you can see, cyber and technology, AXA XL and Lloyd's. And he's a seasoned cyber and technology underwriting manager and has over 15 years experience in this particular field. He's got a deep understanding, and we'll realise that through today's session, of the evolving landscape of cyber risk and tech solutions. And what Dan's really good at is developing tailored underwriting strategies that meet the unique needs of each and every client. And he has an extensive background that helps him assess complex risks effectively, and driving his own creativity, really to support the growth in those businesses in the digital age, rather than to block them. So, Dan, without further ado, let me hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, Patrick, and good morning to everyone. As Patrick said, I'm Dan, or Daniel Garrett. Underwriting Manager for Technology and Cyber Risks at AXA XL. Whilst I'm talking, I've also seen on the chat some of the issues that some of you are facing. So it'd be really useful if one or two of you could shout out on the chat function just to make sure that you can hear me properly before I go continuing. Perfect. Thank you, Fiona. As Patrick said, I wanted to start by thanking all of you for taking the time out of your busy days to join the webinar today. As Patrick said, I'll welcome any questions in that chat function on the system, and we'll get to them at the end as I have allowed some time for those. Hopefully, you'll find the presentation so informative. It'll answer all the questions about cyber risk that you would have faced or had, and we can have a good chat at the end. To begin, a couple of brief disclaimers from me. There are regulatory developments contained in the slide, and there are a couple of slides relating to cyber insurance. To be clear, I'm not a qualified lawyer, so none of this constitutes legal advice, and I'm just a cyber underwriter, so none of this constitutes advice as to purchasing cyber insurance for your own organizations. With that piece out the way, yes, I'm going to move to the agenda. So just this will recap the learning developments and points that Patrick called out in the original slides. So we're going to go through where we're seeing some increased claims activity in the market at the moment, and I will try to avoid and build on things that aren't just ransomware, because I'm sure all of those on the call today have heard a bit about ransomware before. We'll move into the change in regulatory environment, how that may cause organizations challenges. And before closing for questions, we'll go through a selection of current claims scenarios, coupled with how the cyber insurance market in general is trying to meet client needs. Hopefully, again, the slides are moving forwards for you all as well. So any issues, please do kind of shout out on that chat function as well. Thank you very much. So first, I want to set the scene, share some stats and research just that's available in the public domain at the moment, some high-level figures. And I guess the intention of these isn't to cause any scaremongering amongst you that don't buy cyber insurance at the moment. But as some of the news reports, there are some high-profile examples at the moment of organizations that didn't buy cyber insurance and are now suffering as a result. And whilst I started by saying I'm going to try and avoid talking about ransomware as much as I possibly can, unfortunately, at the moment, there's no getting away from ransomware, as it still continues to be the #1 driver for losses, claims in the space. So you'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, I want to draw your attention over there. And it's a year-on-year comparison from number of extortion cases that SRM, who are an insurance incident response provider, have noted the actual decrease in the number of incidents they have handled and assisted with where organizations have actually paid the ransom. We can explore some of those concepts and answer questions on those later. Some of this is driven by theory and speculation, but we could be looking at organizations simply being better prepared with backups, resiliency to their systems. That means they don't have to pay these ransoms at the moment. But for those, before moving on, for those that haven't, for those, I guess, that have been fortunate enough to not have seen a ransomware issue on their systems and encountered it before, just thought I'd share a real example here for you. Sort of thing that may appear on your screen one day, should you be unfortunate. Anecdotally as well, I can share that I have worked at an organisation in a previous role, have been faced with this very situation, and I can absolutely attest to the fact it was not fun. It was not enjoyable trying to work around. Well, that's just a piece. Call that out. And I guess before moving temporarily away from the topic of ransomware, I guess some questions may be asked around, well, just why does ransomware remain so prolific in the current environment? And I've given this some consideration. I'm sure there's plenty of other reasons, but just to give you a few thoughts on this, the perception as to how lucrative this may be for the threat actors, very easy to get large rewards or large extortion payments. How easy it has been to get away with conducting such ransomware attacks, and we'll see a little bit more in some of the slides as we go through that. Enforcement actions, agencies are finally getting to grips with some of these larger threat acting groups. And then the final piece is around just how easy access to some of these tools has become. You can either get access to do-it-yourself kits, or you can even provision ransomware as a service. So on the screen here, we've got a piece around it's effectively a malicious software as a service that's offered, where you can go on, you can buy or parts of or full ransomware kits to deploy at your leisure. And they're created by larger groups and organizations that then pass out into what we call splintered cells, or like private individuals that wish to try and conduct ransomware attacks. So I would say, please, whatever you do, don't now go onto your computer and try and search some of these things, because hopefully, if you're doing it on a work laptop, at least it would pick up that you're searching in the wrong areas. So please don't do this. So the evolving threat landscape away from just pure ransomware events. We're going to have a look at a couple of threat vectors that have changed and that we're seeing come through in some of the cyber insurance claims we're facing at the moment. And I think it's pertinent to point out that the number one threat outside of a straightforward ransomware event here is the impact that AI is having on lowering the barrier to entry for conducting cyber attacks. So there was some research conducted by a threat intelligence firm called Keeler, who has suggested that year on year, so 2013 to 2014, there was a 200% increase in uncensored or jailbroken AI tools that were available online for use to conduct cyber attacks of different types. And how is AI being utilized? Well, there's a couple of examples on the screen there that I won't read now because we'll cover off in the next few slides. But AI is being used to take shortcuts in writing malicious code. So removing the need for individuals to actually be able to code for themselves. There are some documented cases and examples where AI tools have been tricked into writing malicious code that go outside the built-in guardrails. And some of those instances have included trying to prompt for script for educational purposes. So I'm trying to create this piece for a work project or a school project, and suddenly you can get the AI model to start giving you malicious code. AI can also be used to help speed up exploitations and create exploits. So where you've got vulnerabilities existing in systems, AI and code writing can bring forward the speed at which these malicious codes could be deployed onto networks. And it can also be utilized to perimeter scan the wider internet for existing known vulnerabilities and create a quicker picture as to where a threat actor may or may not wish to spend their time to have the best opportunity to monetize any particular threat or actions that they wish to conduct. And for those of you that are looking at the slide and saying, well, you know, why is the funny re sat in the top left corner in brackets? Well, the two other examples here that we'll go through in the slides are really AI being utilized to trick people, individuals, with threats that have existed before. They're just now becoming better and more convincing to actually exploit these threats. So turning to the next slide and the impact of AI. So as I've just mentioned, many of you will be familiar with there being three or perceived pillars of cybersecurity. So that's technology and technological tooling, processes that sit around the utilization of that technology, and then people. And it's often the case that people are, unfortunately, the weakest links when it comes to cybersecurity. And AI is really helping make it easier to trick people than probably ever before. So starting with the concept of deep fakes and the creation of deep fakes. So I'm sure it's a term that many of you are familiar with. At the top there, it calls out what the definition of a deep fake. But the point to be looking at here from an AI perspective and a criminal perspective is that AI is enabling better, more convincing cons to be conducted, to call upon human weakness or susceptibility, and also get around some common risk management protections and best practices that are put in place. So skipping things like secondary verifications on payment requests, or bypassing some form of technological process that's been put in place to help protect an organization. So here's the example of phishing attacks, and possibly to show you a little bit of the years I've been in the cyber risk list. I ask those that are on the call to cast your mind back to a distant past where many of you will be familiar with having received an email in the past or text in the past that says you've got a long lost distant relative that's going to leave you some huge inheritance because you are the next in line to, and yet all you have to do is go ahead and put this small amount of money forward to set up a bank account to enable this, or pay the legal fees to enable the transfer of all of these assets to you. And I think when you think about this now in current society, you may well laugh at the thought of this, being tricked by some of these tactics. Some of this is then that you've learned, society is caught up, and you've been trained to be able to identify that you probably aren't going to inherit a massive estate or huge financial sum of money from a long lost distant relative. As I say, fast forward this, and again, organizations have spent a lot of time in training staff around the legitimacy of inbound emails. So for those that I was just noticing in the chat, there's some people with some technical difficulties, but for those that can see the slides, the left-hand side has got a phishing email, which I hope you can all see in large font. And you're going to be looking at that, and I know it calls out some of the mistakes on there, but you're going to be looking at that, and you're going to have been trained now to identify some of the common pitfalls from a phishing email. So the email address not looking legitimate, it's being sent at weird hours, there's a sense of urgency for you to have to do something, there are spelling mistakes, it doesn't sound like the person you think it should sound like, because they are not talking in the same way, they're not using the same syntax they would normally use, and you've got unknown bank account details that you're being asked to transfer some funds to. So all of you would have successfully identified that as a phishing attempt, and you would have reported to your internal phishing procedures. So that's because of training and human awareness, and you've just become used to this as a threat. Hopefully we're picking it up. If we move to the right hand side, for those that again may be familiar with this, but there was an instance earlier this year out in Hong Kong that a worker was tricked on a Zoom call, transferring $25 million. How? Well, they were on a Zoom call. They had the chief financial officer there. They had the head of HR there. They had the head of legal, all deep faked to create this sense that the individual had trust and legitimacy because they could see the individuals they were interacting with on the screen. They wouldn't necessarily have been trained to think that a threat like this may exist, or was even possible at this point in time. And so they went ahead, made the $25 million payment, probably never to see the majority of that money again. And it's just an example of, as I say, it's an example of AI being used to trick people, but the threat is still the original threat that we faced many years ago. On to the next slide, again, looking at the ability for deep fakes to be utilized. So this isn't a pure ransomware encryption event on a network. This is a threat that using deep fake technology, you can create videos or images of senior figures at organizations in doing compromising things or allegedly doing these compromising things, and therefore being extorted to prevent a leak of this fake video or deep fake video to the wider internet. And what's really troubling or particularly worrying about this sort of trend that's emerging is that none of this is relying on any form of network intrusion. So these guys are not getting into a network. So all of the security technological processes that have been put in place are working. No one's got in, and yet you've still got this external threat extorting an individual such as the CEO through just utilizing the ability to create really convincing deep fakes. And finally, another example on your screen again of AI being utilized to create fake workers or fake histories for workers, creating fake identities, creating fake profiles that make an individual look a legitimate candidate for a role, and actually they become a plant into an organization that is then utilizes the insider threat to extract data or to get up to any untoward trouble within an organization's network. So in this instance, again, you're not creating a network intrusion, you're not bypassing security defenses per se, you're just putting a person on the inside that then will have legitimate ability to utilize some of the technology systems of an organization, but to commit criminal offenses. And this calls into question how employment screening processes may need to adapt going forwards to create another level of safeguard or another process perhaps to prevent an action like this happening to you if you feel that you're a target or for a potential malicious person being embedded into your organization. Sorry, my tech failed. My tech froze on me for a minute there, so I hope you're all still with me. Moving us slightly away from the continual emergence of AI as a threat, we're going to turn our focus to law enforcement for a moment, and how law enforcement globally is trying to keep track and pace with the cyber threat landscape around us. So calling out, despite the doom and gloom that you may be feeling from the first few slides, it's not all doom and gloom. The good news is that law enforcement efforts are being stepped up. Law enforcement are becoming more proactive, taking cyber criminals and cyber networks out. And this example from Operation Kronos was the takedown of Lockbit and Evil Corp that were significantly prevalent a couple of years back. The challenge with this, unfortunately, though, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time, is that whilst some individuals, employees, etc., I call them employees of these organizations, but some individuals were identified, enforcement actions were taken, arrests, sanctions. Unfortunately, the reality is that the majority of the network then spread out, splintered off into different new groups to recycle some of the technology, some of the code that they had at their disposal to effectively recreate themselves under a new name, but to carry on conducting criminal activities. So the point here is that threat actors normally are opportunistic and nimble. They are trying to create new ways and think of new methodologies to trick or bypass technological failures. But there are significant efforts now from law enforcement to take the fight back to the criminal networks and coordinate many actions to prevent the systemic spread of ransomware in particular. Just another example here, again, law enforcement's making significant step to a huge incident to a company called Snowflake that affected a significant number of their customers that were large corporate networks. And as I've said before, so whilst the enforcement actions create short-term disruption to the criminal enterprises, okay? They force the criminals to go away to rebuild infrastructure and rebuild reputations, but they're not going to solve the problem. They are just attempting to create as much disruption as possible. And so therefore it's up to organizations to take steps themselves to make sure they are not the lowest hanging fruit or easily become victims of ransomware attacks or malicious attacks onto the organizations. You're going to need a more comprehensive toolkit, both organizationally and from an enforcement perspective. Something that Snowflake did address and bring to light, which there's a couple more slides on a bit later in the presentation, were around how single organizations such as a Snowflake in this example may become the target for a malicious threat actor, simply because once you're into that network, you can expand and you will have, that's seen as a single point of failure that then gives you access to, in this case, 165 customers. worth of data, of which AT&T will one, and therefore you'll suddenly got access to millions and millions of data records from AT&T. And just moving to the final slide on the threat actor evolution, again, to not wish to restate some of the points that I've just made, but if you look at the bar chart on your left of the screen, this is the number of credible, well-known ransomware groups that exist. So in 2022, you see there's just under 40 groups that are well known to the community. The minute you close one down, 2, 3 more appear. So fast forward 2 years, you've now got 120 that are being watched, that are known, that are conducting attacks on a regular basis. It just depicts the difficulty, and again calls out the difficulty that any form of law enforcement may be able to, the difficulty law enforcement has when trying to tackle such a big problem is that for every proactive win they get, 2 or 3 negative new credible threat actors become into existence. So on that point, and just to pause before I move on to kind of the next topic, and I'm going to have a quick sip of water. Just want to give you time to reflect on some of the content, because I may well have rattled through some of that quite quickly. To give you a chance, I'm going to direct you and plug the question part of the app at this point in time. So if you've got any questions that come up from the first part of this content, please do feel free to chuck them in the chat functionality now. Okay. So the regulatory landscape and why this may be proving challenging for organizations, for cyber insurers, and the general cyberspace. Again, just to remind all of you, I'm not a lawyer. None of this is legal advice. I'm a cyber underwriter operating in the cyberspace. But what I hope that the next few slides do bring out to you is that there are a number of pieces of legislation that have either come into force or are coming into force that are from UK, EU and beyond, and just highlights the challenges that organizations and risk management practices face when trying to keep up to date with all of these changes that may affect your organization. And it also calls into the potential for there being an increase in cyber claims for the cyber insurance market out there, given the number of new regulations that are coming in, the potential for new regulatory enforcement actions or investigations for organizations that have inadvertently or indeed deliberately fallen foul of some of these new pieces of legislation. So starting with the EU, and without making it about Brexit, these were going to affect all organizations that are going to have any form of European footprint. So there's 4 ones that I've pulled out here. And the focus of at least 3 of these is to, I guess, harden the economies, to reduce the potential for there being really easy cyber vulnerabilities that exist in the ecosystem or in the supply chain. And starting with DORA, or the Digital Operational Resilience Act, mouthful. It's targeted at the financial sector, the financial industry in the first instance, so banks, insurance companies. And it's designed to ensure that the entities are able to withstand, respond to, and recover from IT disruption, including cyber attacks, or indeed system failures due to operational error. For example, it encompasses IT or ICT risk management practices, testing, incident response, and general information sharing. And I guess I've called out the major incident, the major ICT related incident on the screen, and the general definition. And I guess the challenge that may come from at an organizational level is, determining whether or not an incident, if you're an affected organization, whether an incident falls foul of this, and therefore requires you to go down the route of conducting the mandatory reporting to necessary regulators. Similarly, moving on to NIS2, or the Network and Information Security Directive 2. Again, it has a similar aim to strengthen cybersecurity requirements, but this time focusing more on critical sectors, which may include things like power generation, internet infrastructure, etc., that may or may not end up with a significant detrimental impact to a member state. So again, you'll see on the screen a large-scale cybersecurity incident, which means, and I won't read it all to you, but I guess again a similar challenge to what I called out with DORA is around how do you, as at an organizational level, make the decision as to whether the incident that you may or may not be facing triggers or complies with that definition, and therefore dictates the steps that you have to take. And it remains to be seen whether there's going to be significant interest from any of the member state regulators here as to whether they conduct any form of significant investigations now that NIS2 directive is fully in place. Next on the screen, the EU AI Act. So this is seen as a world first in many respects for a comprehensive set of regulations around the utilization of artificial intelligence. And now, whilst the full extent and scope of this act may or may not impact many of you on this call, as most of this is directed at the providers and developers of AI, and particularly those that are creating high-risk products. It's important to just be aware of, and that the Act encompasses any form of AI that's made commercially available on the EU market, irrespective of the country of origin, so it has extraterrestrial reach. Within the Act, there are some classifications that I won't go into all of them, but just around what AI tool may or may not be acceptable, high risk or limited risk, and therefore the varying degrees of regulations that impact. Again, to distinguish between high, limited, medium risk, there is an element of subjectivity in there, which could cause complications and could cause grey area for compliance with the Act. And finally, you have the EU, the Cyber Resilience Act here. So this is designed to support a more secure and safe digital world. That's the strapline, and it's focusing on products with a digital element. And so a digital element within the definition has software or hardware, and it's remote data processing solutions that include the embedded hardware or software that are being placed on the market. And it's an obligation to ensure these are effectively secure by design. And why is it important to call this out again? There's new standards for security that products are going to have to comply with, or solutions and software as a service providers are going to have to comply with, to make sure products are safe and secure, with the financial penalties for non-compliance with the Act, as noted on the screen there, potentially significant. Okay. And as if EU legislation wasn't enough, a couple of UK specific ones. The Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, again, designed to focus on ensuring the UK and cyber defensives for critical infrastructure and digital businesses that are relied upon are secure. Okay, I won't go into the full extent of this, but the intention is to expand the regulatory reach to enable the UK to be more secure and actually increase reporting standards so that the UK government has a better idea and handle on the cyber security landscape and the cyber threat landscape. We have the Digital Use and Access Bill, creating new forms of new exemptions to how information may be shared, including legitimate interests and lawful basis for sharing information, that don't overrule or don't contradict GDPR, but they're designed to sit alongside and complement. And finally, you then have back to ransomware. Sorry, we can't get away from it. The Home Office proposals to ban the payment of ransomwares. And they've conducted a consultation earlier this year with 3 proposals focusing on a complete ban for certain sectors or industries. Those include critical national infrastructure and public sector, a ransomware payment prevention regime that will require notification to the regulator effectively to seek permission to pay a ransom, and finally a mandatory incident reporting scheme. And whilst there isn't a defined timeline as to when there may or may not be any form of legislation that comes into effect, based on the feedback, the Home Office are going to be moving forward with all 3 of these proposals. There are many questions that still need to be answered, but there's going to be more to come on that in future. And finally, we have the global regulatory landscape. Again, I won't read all of these, but they're just further enforcement actions from around the world for varying cyber incidents, including data transfer or data security issues. Hopefully, the previous 4 slides, are going to draw out just how complex a world that organizations currently live in, and therefore the challenges faced to keep up to date with all of these pieces of legislation. Claims. So the penultimate topic. So the CrowdStrike incident, I'm sure, has been covered multiple times, and I'm sure most of you on the call are going to be aware that deemed as a catastrophic cyber event, software configuration issue meant that approximately 8.5 million systems became unavailable globally. Whilst it was an internal software configuration update issue that caused this outage, there's a piece around what could have happened or what would have been worse had it been a malicious attack. But it brings out a couple of other key points, and one being around the systemic nature and the systemic risk of cyber. You've got the interconnectivity and the software reliance that spans geographies, industries, and client size. Hopefully, some of the earlier legislation just spoken through might help bring some security and stability. And secondly, it's the importance of focusing on supply chain management. So even with the best security controls in place at an organizational level, you may well still find yourself affected by things that are outside of your control. Questions that may be coming to mind from a risk perspective here are around how you may well manage potential supply chain dependencies and what you need to be thinking about from a disaster scenario perspective, that if you wake up through no fault of your own, you can't get access to your systems, what are you going to do? Just a couple of current cyber incidents. So Patrick at the start started off with JLR and reference to that for those that could hear him at the time. But I'm going to start on TfL. The incident goes back to 2024 and is claimed to have caused approximately £39 million worth of disruption and damage. And it was associated to the scattered spider network. So this draws out a couple of key points really for me. Another success. So there has been a successful prosecution against two individuals, a UK-based pair of teenagers that have carried out this attack. So law enforcement has caught up with these two individuals, but also speaks to the ease at which some tools that cause £39 million worth of disruption are readily available for two teenagers to go and deploy against TfL. The Heathrow disruption, or the wider aerospace disruption, supply chain impact. So slightly more restricted than the CrowdStrike issue, but again, single IT point of failure, causing chaos across the UK and Europe from a flight perspective. It was only yesterday I was reading that, again, positive win, law enforcement have identified a suspect who's been arrested on suspicion of causing this act, but again, just pulls out that supply chain dependency thing. And finally, the most topical at the moment is JLR. So whilst the exact issues and the exact cause of the disruption here remains unclear, what it does bring out is some of the complexities that are associated both from a connectivity and systems connectivity perspective, but also challenges around manufacturing sites, because you would see from various news articles and press that the date for production to be restarted continuously gets pushed back, which may suggest more issues are being identified. It may suggest that the incident response plan that JLR may or may not have had in place hasn't quite worked as they expected it to. Again, they've done this, and as I said earlier, unfortunately, don't have the benefit of cyber insurance at this point in time if the news articles are to be believed. So finally, from me, the adaptation of cyber insurance. Again, this isn't advice on what you should or shouldn't be buying. For those that don't buy on the call, at least. For those that have been a purchaser of cyber insurance for a number of years, you may well have experienced several adaptations of your policy, be it premium changes, be it limit availability changes, or be it specific coverages, to name but a few things that have happened. Whilst I hope from what you've seen in the topics just discussed at really high level, there are a continual evolution of the threat landscape out there, which constantly is changing at an ever increasing pace. But in light of all of this, the cyber insurance market are striving to continuously innovate products, provide meaningful coverage to organizations that meet your needs and the challenges you face on a daily basis. So as a non-plug for AXA XL's cyber insurance policy, just cyber in general. On the right, you've got the average cost, again, using some SRM data, who market leading in this space. The average cost suffered to an organization with and without insurance. So that goes back to 2023. A large global broking firm issued a report just yesterday using some YouGov data that they actually expect that delta to be even bigger at this point in time. Why cyber insurance and how we help? Well, recovery and access to panels in the event of a claim or incident. Again, it's kind of how you would expect a traditional policy to respond. You know, you have an issue, you call your insurance provider or someone on their panel, and they help. Right? No different to a property fire or a casualty slip trip in sort of injury. But where we continue to try and drive innovation and adaptation to meet your needs, so tailoring coverage as one area. So cyber insurance isn't just around ransomware, it is around regulatory issues, investigations, but bringing to light coverage such as dependent business interruption for when you are not the victim, but where you suffer an outage or an issue due to a cyber issue further upstream or downstream. And finally, from me, I guess the continued evolution and offer for pre-loss and proactive services that a number of carriers will now provide in various different guises that go just beyond an insurance policy written on a piece of paper and a promise to pay a claim. Things may include additional help with phishing tests, instant response plan testing, tabletop exercises, etc. So I guess my plug for when you're looking at potentially purchasing cyber insurance, look at what other services your provider may be able to offer you, because cyber insurance should be around proactive and a collaborative relationship between your insurer, yourselves, and your insurance broker, as opposed to just purely about the premium. I guess a whistle-stop tour from me, and that brings me towards the end of my presentation. So I'm just going to call out the learning objectives that we started with. So hopefully I've covered off and met some of these learning or all of these learning objectives for you over the last 45 minutes. Again, I'd like to thank you all for your time that you've taken out of your busy day to take part in this and to listen to me speak. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Patrick and time for questions.
Good. Well, I am praying that you can hear me. So if I can have a thumbs up, then that would be good. I'm suffering my own personal technology issues this morning, ironically enough. Dan, thanks very much for a really broad but also deep presentation. Timely, interesting, and full of new knowledge. I think it's fair to say that, you know, cyber risk and how it crystallizes is in everybody's mind because it's on the news right here, right now, and with added frequency. But so is AI. And I just wanted, we have a call from the room, a question from Tim. As AI capabilities continue to evolve, do you think, Dan, that deep fakes will actually become the biggest threat? And how do you think an organization can counter that threat?
That's a nice broad question. So thanks, Tim, for posing that one. I guess if I were to crystal ball gaze, and unfortunately, when we go making these predictions, the speed at which technology continues to evolve will often mean, or in my case, will mean that I'm wrong no matter what I say. But I do see that the deepfakes will continue to grow as a threat. I guess the threat that they bring, it could well be to continue to proliferate the ease at which ransomware events could be posed, or indeed conduct further social engineering and effectively crime sort of payment transfers. Right? So yes, it will continue to evolve. I think instances and looking over the past, you have technological developments that are also being used to fight AI. So almost a situation where AI fights AI, or robot versus robot in a futuristic sort of world. But when I take that back a little bit, I think the main thing that organizations can do to counter the threat of AI, particularly from a deep fake perspective, is that continual training piece, right? It's information sharing. So the more you train individuals, the more examples you provide, the more aware of these new threats that individuals become aware of, right? The easier it is going to be for an individual to detect. So if we look at the instance that we talk about, the Hong Kong, the payment transfer, easy to sit here and say from a retrospective perspective, and looking back with 2020 vision here, why would the head of legal and your head of HR be on a call asking you to pay money? Right? So yes, it's real. The individual's tricked into thinking it's real because they're legitimate people. The individual can see faces, etc. But why would that happen in that instance? Is that the regular process that organization has in place to request $25 million to be paid at that point in time? you can then add in a secondary effect, a secondary piece that, around how else can you validate that? So secondary phone call to a known number or anything like that. So we do have some of these processes in place already at an organizational level and at a training level. It's just making sure that it's the most up to date it possibly can be. The more you're aware, the less likely you are to fall foul of something like this.
Thanks, Dan. And really, as an observation, and particularly post-COVID, with so many organisations moving to a hybrid working, that kind of means that employees are more reliant on technology to do their work rather than everybody being in a physical office, sitting in rows of desks next to each other, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. So, I mean, I think as risk managers think about the technical issue and the cyber risk, think also in the context of the way in which our organisations work. Now, Dan, you've shared with us a real span of cyber risk and how it may crystallise. But from your experience, if there was one area of cyber security that you would urge organisations to prioritise, what would that be?
So to not sound a bit like a broken record on that one, Patrick, it's around people, right? So I think no matter, a CISO described to me only the other day, right? If a threat actor really wants to get into your organization, right? This piece around you build a wall as a defense, they build a higher ladder. So you build your bigger wall, they continue to expand their ladder. So if a threat actor really wants to get in, there's only so much an organizational level you can do to that sort of malicious attack. But what you really need to be doing is spending time to stop the really easy network intrusions, right? And that, unfortunately, comes down to people because we're fallible to mistakes. We're susceptible to the emotions, our wider environment, fatigue, even, right? Whereas it's really hard to create fatigue for a computer that's processing based on rules and rules only, right? So I think the people awareness piece to cyber threat is the number one thing that I think organizations just need to keep on their agenda.
Lovely, thank you. And well, that's a good takeaway for us. One quick, very, very quick question with a one-line answer. In reality, when you look at the world, Dan, do you think cyber is now the modern terrorism and really the emerging theatre of war?
Cyber warfare, cyber terrorism. It's a really broad topic, Patrick. So yes, in a broad level, I would say you're less reliant on guns, fields, etc., more cyber threat, espionage, malicious attacks.
So I think that's our answer, guys. Armed with the last hour of Daniel's insights and knowledge, expertly delivered, I think we can be assured that cyber risk isn't going away. Insurance has its part to play in managing that risk. And it sounds to me as though the cyber insurance market remains vibrant and proactive in trying to respond to the evolving cyber risk landscape. So with that, we're at a minute to 11. I promised the hard stop so we can all get on. Thank you very much indeed, Dan. Great session, great knowledge. The recording will be on the emic.com website, so people to pick up and refresh if you'd so like. And thanks to everybody for joining today. Just do click on the survey, please, as you leave. It'll take you about 15 seconds to complete to show your appreciation to Dan. Thank you very much indeed, and everybody enjoy today's sunshine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks all.